This is Molly Hemingway, encouraging you to listen to my favorite podcast, Issues, Etc. Every day you get in-depth interviews with host Todd Wilkin asking expert guests substantive, thought-provoking questions on all of the important news and issues of our day. The expert guests are in culture, law, ethics, philosophy, theology, and apologetics. Expert guests, expansive topics, always extolling Christ. Issues, etc.
The more you go to church, the more you sit in a pew, the more likely you are to vote for culturally conservative candidates.
You're never God. Whenever you say that you are divine or you have this divine inner spark or this divine inner self, it's actually the devil persuading you, tricking you into thinking that you are God.
When they got into the boat, Matthew records, there was a great calm. The ark, the ships, they're all pictures of the church. And I like to tell my members that I always feel the safest from the assaults of devil, world, and flesh when I'm in the divine service.
In most secular worldviews, suffering is an ultimate evil, and it's to be avoided at all costs. It's a senseless interruption to a life of flourishing. But contrastingly, St. Paul redefines suffering as an intrinsic marker of Christian identity and of ultimate glorification.
Grandmothers love listening to Issues, etc. while changing sheets on the beds for the grandkids' visit to the farm.
Abortion pills are a problem. Over a dozen states have outlawed chemical abortion pills, but because of an order made by the Biden administration, women in those states can simply go online, order abortion pills, and they come in the mail. No doctor required. Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Thanks for tuning us in live on this Tuesday afternoon, the 25th of August. Thomas Jipping will join us to talk about the U.S. Department of Justice and mail-order abortions. A little bit later, we'll spend some time with Dr. Charles Schultz of Concordia University, Chicago, remembering St. Augustine and his mother, Monica. Thomas Jipping is Senior Legal Fellow in the Edwin Meese III Institute for the Rule of Law at Advancing American Freedom. He's author of a recent column for The Federalist titled DOJ Should End the Dangerous Loophole, Shielding Illegal Abortion Drugs. Thomas, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me.
How do you explain the Trump administration's failure to roll back the Biden administration's policy on chemical abortions and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration?
Well, I think if you remember from the 2024 campaign, President Trump sent a lot of mixed messages about his position on abortion pills, and some of them were rather favorable in terms of wanting to expand access to abortion pills. So I think the underlying position with regard to abortion pills itself is somewhat mixed. Secretary Kennedy at the Department of HHS said in his confirmation hearing last year that he would review the evidence for the harms from mifepristone, which is the drug that causes most abortions today. As far as I know, that review has not started, and that's been almost a year and a half. There again, Kennedy's own position on abortion, it tends to the pro-choice side. So it's hard to say if they're dragging their feet, if there's an internal kind of conflict, but the fact is that with regard to mifepristone itself, it is an extremely harmful drug, and the Food and Drug Administration ought to put politics aside and see to it that drugs that are available to the public are safe.
What is the Comstock Act, and how does it apply to the distribution of abortion pills?
The Comstock Act is a law that was enacted in 1873. It's named after William Comstock, who was a well-known crusader against things like abortion and pornography back in the 19th century. It's a pretty straightforward law. It says, and it's still on the books, it prohibits the Postal Service from mailing, quote, any article or thing designed, adapted, or intended for producing abortion, unquote. Now, I worked in the United States Senate for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of statutes that are really, really complicated and confused. This is not one of them. That's a pretty straightforward ban on sending or receiving anything that can be used for producing an abortion. And of course, mifepristone was created specifically for that purpose. So if we believe that, laws on the books mean something and ought to be enforced, federal law prohibits mailing abortion drugs.
How did the Biden administration argue that the Comstock Act is essentially unenforceable?
Well, there are some basic rules about how to interpret statutes, and the Justice Department has an office called the Office of Legal Counsel that gives advice about questions that involve statutes. So when the Supreme Court reversed Roe versus Wade, the Postal Service asked the Office of Legal Counsel, does the Comstock Act prohibit us from mailing abortion drugs? Now, I quoted to you at the top what the law actually says. It's really straightforward. But the Biden administration was the most pro-abortion in history, and they were looking to remove obstacles to wider abortion at every turn. So the Office of Legal Counsel gave an opinion to the Postal Service that tried to twist the Comstock Act into legal pretzels. They said that you can only enforce the Comstock Act if the sender of abortion drugs intends the recipient of abortion drugs to use them illegally. Now, none of that is in the statute. They simply made it up. And if the Postal Service is supposed to know what the sender intends, what the recipient's going to do, they're not going to be able to know any of that, which means as a practical matter, they can't enforce the Comstock Act, which is what the goal was all along. But along the way, the Justice Department violated all of the basic rules about fairly and objectively interpreting statutes. They're supposed to say what the law is and how it applies. They're not supposed to twist it to serve an agenda.
What is the current Department of Justice doing regarding abortion pills being distributed through the mail?
Well, as people may have heard in the news, we have a new Attorney General, Todd Blanche, who was recently confirmed by the Senate. And during his confirmation hearing, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, Treasury Committee, asked him, he said, are you willing to review that Office of Legal Counsel opinion about the Comstock Act just to make sure that they're sticking to what the law actually says, which of course is what they're supposed to do. And Blanche said that they would. Now, that's encouraging because at least they're going to review that opinion. And, whatever your position on abortion, the Office of Legal Counsel is supposed to read statutes the way they're written, and they're supposed to give objective legal advice. They didn't. They politicized this opinion, and the new Attorney General says he's going to review it. We're convinced that, if he does that and does it thoroughly, he's going to see that that opinion needs to be withdrawn because it is not a faithful, objective evaluation of the statute.
So give us a history of how the dangers of the abortion pill have been known for almost 30 years.
Mifepristone was first developed by a French company in the 1980s, and the FDA initially banned its importation because it's so dangerous to women. And as usual, political activists got in the way. They pressured the FDA to approve it, which it did in 2000, but they had to use a special fast-track procedure that they usually use only for drugs that treat life-threatening illnesses. And of course, pregnancy is not a life-threatening illness. But they only approved it with very strict safety regulations because everybody, all of their evaluators said this could only be used by close medical supervision. So they required that women not only obtain the drug, but actually use the drug in a physician's office. And the FDA retained that rule for almost 16 years because there's a potential for so many complications. There were also a lot of unusual steps that the FDA took with their evaluation process. Probably the most blatant is that they dropped the requirement, which usually accompanies every drug, the requirement that physicians report to the FDA medical complications from women who use the drug. And the FDA, after a while, said, oh, you only have to report complications that are fatal. You don't have to report any complications that don't actually kill the woman. Well, 5 years later, the FDA turns around and says, hey, there's no evidence that there's any non-fatal complications. And so they drop the rest of their safety rules. The Ethics and Public Policy Center, one of the real champions for life and for our liberty here in Washington, they actually looked at real insurance records, insurance claims in cases where women had used mifepristone and had medical complications. They studied thousands of them. They found that there were severe complications in more than 11% of cases. Now, this is more than 20 times worse than what the FDA publicly said as they were trying to approve mifepristone and get rid of all the safety rules. There's just a huge cover-up going on here. This is a very dangerous drug. It still is a very dangerous drug. And there's been a lot of politics that has gotten in the way of the medicine along the way.
How has the FDA attempted to cover up the dangers of chemical abortion?
Well, I mentioned one, and it goes back to kind of fudging the evidence when the FDA first approved mifepristone. Ordinarily, they're supposed to look at evidence of how a drug would affect the population of people who would likely use it. They never did any evaluation of evidence, for example, regarding how this drug would affect minors. And the way that they reported the results of some of these studies was very suspect, to the point where there's a couple of physicians groups that have been trying, either through the FDA or through the courts, to get this process reviewed objectively and to get to the bottom of whether this drug, which now causes more than 60% of the abortions in this country, whether this drug is actually too harmful for women and ought to be pulled from the market.
Is there any doubt as to the evidence that the abortion pill is unsafe?
I don't believe there's any doubt that this is a very dangerous drug. It all depends on what standard you're using, whether it's just objective medical evidence, whether it's kind of a lowest common denominator type of approach. The FDA uses the language of safe and effective, but that means a certain thing. They mean it's kind of a minimum standard in order to allow a drug to be put on the market. But because of all the doubts about its safety, the safety rules and restrictions that have been put in place from the beginning are needed now more than ever. And this is why, the danger of the FDA treating this as if it's not much more than taking a Tylenol is really kind of a scandal. In 2020, sadly, it's the medical group of gynecologists and obstetricians. They went to court to say, you ought to drop this rule that women have to get this drug directly from physicians. And they used the COVID pandemic as kind of a shield, sort of a fake excuse. Well, a year later, the Biden administration announced that they weren't going to enforce that safety restriction, and they never mentioned the pandemic. This is the kind of politics that are getting in the way, where abortion and the abortion agenda is number one, and we're sacrificing the health of women. One of the worst things that's happening here, way back when, and I've been involved in the pro-life movement for a long time, we used to hear the rhetoric of abortion should be between a woman and her doctor. Well, now, thanks to the Biden administration, women can get a prescription and get the drug itself without ever seeing a doctor. The part of the abortion business that is focused on these abortion drugs is actually separating women from their doctors. It's isolating women. And so women who suffer all these complications have to go to the emergency room. Who are they going to call? Who are they going to talk to? They never got the drug directly from a doctor. And if they did through the internet, the doctor is probably somewhere in New York. So this is a real crisis for the medical profession as well as a continuing serious harm to women.
Tell us about this case, Louisiana v. the FDA, and why it's important.
Well, since the Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade, that gave permission to states, which they had before 1973, to prohibit abortion, either surgical abortion or chemical abortion. And about half the states have enacted laws of various kinds, and about a dozen of them, including Louisiana, have a law that prohibits medical abortion. Well, we're in the age of the internet, where, as I just suggested, women can go online, get a prescription, and order the drug from doctors in a pro-abortion state like New York, and they can then be sent through the mail, which violates federal law, and receiving that in Louisiana violates state law. So Louisiana has sued the FDA. A few other states like Missouri have done so as well, because this is an organized campaign to undermine and violate state law and to kill babies in a pro-life state. And that campaign wouldn't be possible except for these steps that the FDA has taken. The FDA is really responsible for creating a situation where there's now widespread violations of state law. So Louisiana has sued the FDA to get a judgment about that and to get the FDA to reinstate the safety restrictions so that women once again have to actually see a doctor to obtain this dangerous drug.
What then should the U.S. Department of Justice do?
Well, at the very least, and I'm glad you asked at the top about the opinion that they had issued, at the very least, the Department of Justice should withdraw this corrupt opinion that was issued by the Biden Justice Department trying to create cover for sending abortion drugs when that violates federal law explicitly. They should withdraw that opinion for two reasons. Number one, it's wrong on the law, and that's pretty easy to show. But number two, it really hurts the reputation of the Justice Department when they have something like this prepared that is so blatantly political. It ignores all of the rules about how you're supposed to properly interpret statutes. And it really does a lot of damage to the reputation of the Office of Legal Counsel. If I were them, no matter what my politics, I would want to preserve the integrity of that office, and it has really taken a hit with this sort of stunt, and they should at least withdraw that. The next question is whether they will actually enforce the Comstock Act. It hasn't been enforced for a long time, and that's a somewhat more political question, but at the very least, they should withdraw that OLC opinion about the Comstock Act.
Thomas Jipping is Senior Legal Fellow in the Edwin Meese III Institute for the Rule of Law at Advancing American Freedom. He's author of a recent column for The Federalist titled DOJ Should End the Dangerous Loophole, Shielding Illegal Abortion Drugs. You'll find a link to this column and to Advancing American Freedom on the podcast page at issuesetc.org. Tom, thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Folks, you have until September 1st to register for Lutherans for Life's Fall Gala in Des Moines, Iowa. The gala will feature a fellowship hour, a ministry update, and a keynote address from Dr. James Lamb. Learn more at lutheransforlife.org and look for the LFL Fall Gala event page, lutheransforlife.org. We'll remember St. Augustine and his mother Monica with Dr. Charles Schultz next.
And I think we have to ask, do today's Marxist activists have any reason to say that they hate above anyone else in the world the church leaders most celebrated by our cultural elites? Or do they find that their efforts are not only not hampered by Christian cultural elites, but are in fact helped by them?
Megan Basham of the Daily Wire speaking at the 2026 Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
We must resist the infiltrators and use our power in such a way that when those who oppose the cause of Christ are asked who they hate most in the world, they think of our names.
You can watch Megan Basham making the case against progressive influence in the church from this year's Making the Case conference. For a contribution of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch the entire conference. Learn more at issuesetc.org.
Defending life from beginning to end. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's Life Ministry cares for pregnant women sharing the love of Christ. Listen to Pastor Ed DeWitt with Redeeming Life Outreach Ministries.
One of the first residents we had said to me, "Pastor, why do you do this?" And I said, "Just stick with me through this class, and when we're done, you'll understand completely." Many of the women, as they go through the instruction, when we get to that part about baptism, they're like, "Pastor, I want that for my baby. I want my baby to be adopted into God's family."
God's Mission Here, lcms.org/national mission.